February 4th started like any other morning inside that home. The woman in that video, the one joking, laughing, acting out those skits about relationships, even making light of dark situations, that was Rolanda Watkins. Online, people knew her as Snooki. She had that kind of presence where the moment she started talking, you paid attention. It didn't matter what she was joking about, wigs, everyday life, even uncomfortable topics. She had a way of turning it into something people laughed at. That was her space. That was how people saw her. And the man in those videos, the one she stood beside, the one she publicly celebrated year after year, that was her husband, Jerry Watkins III. When the clip played, I left all my hoes for this. To Rolanda and everyone who followed their content online, it was framed as a joke, and it landed as a joke. From the outside, it looked like a couple sharing moments, building memories, doing what so many others do online. But here's the part that changes everything. When you go back and watch those same videos now, knowing how this story ends, the laughter doesn't feel the same. The jokes don't land the same. And some of the things that once sounded harmless start to feel very different. If you're new here, this is True Crime Stories Chronicles. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss stories like this. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from right now? Now think about this for a second. Have you ever seen a couple online, posting happy moments, smiling, laughing, looking like everything was fine? But something about it didn't feel right. Because in this case, what people saw online, and what was actually happening inside that home, were two completely different realities. Rolanda Watkins was the kind of person whose life didn't revolve around herself. It revolved around her children. At 32 years old, she wasn't chasing attention or trying to impress anyone. Her focus was simple, but demanding. Every day she woke up with the same responsibility on her shoulders, making sure her daughters were okay. Her world was built around routines, getting them ready, making sure they had what they needed, keeping the house running, even on days when she was tired. The kind of work that often goes unnoticed but holds everything together. People who knew her didn't describe her as loud or flashy. They described her as present. If something needed to be done, Rolanda handled it. If someone needed support, she showed up. That was just who she was. And at the center of all of it were her children. 6 daughters. 6 young lives that depended on her for stability, for care, for guidance. Everything she did, every decision, every sacrifice was tied to them. They weren't just part of her life, they were her life. Inside that home, she wasn't just mom in name. She was structure. She was comfort. She was the person they went to when something felt wrong, and the one they relied on when everything felt uncertain. Her days weren't perfect. No household ever is, especially with that many responsibilities. There was noise, movement, pressure, but also moments of connection. The kind of everyday life that feels ordinary until it's gone. Family members would later speak about her with a mix of love and disbelief. They talked about how much she cared, how much she gave, how deeply she was involved in her children's lives. There was no question about her role. She was there, fully. And that's what makes what happened next so difficult to process. Because nothing about her life on the surface suggested it would end the way it did. Rolanda Watkins wasn't raising her children alone. At the center of her personal life was Jerry Watkins III, her husband and the father of her children. To people outside the home, they were seen as a couple trying to make life work together. 2 adults sharing responsibilities, raising a family, navigating everyday pressures. And on the surface, that image held. They appeared together. They shared moments that looked normal, at times, even happy. The kind of relationship that didn't immediately raise alarm to outsiders scrolling past a video or hearing their names in conversation. But relationships aren't defined by what people see occasionally. They're defined by what happens consistently, behind closed doors. And in this case, those closest to Rolanda knew things weren't always smooth. There were ongoing issues in the marriage, tension that didn't just appear overnight. It had been there, building over time. Not necessarily loud enough for the world to hear, but present enough for family members to recognize that something wasn't right. Arguments happened. What makes this harder to understand is how easily that reality can exist alongside a completely different image. Because at the same time these issues were unfolding, there were also moments being shared that told a different story. Smiles, laughter, videos that suggested connection, closeness, normalcy. To anyone watching from the outside, it could look like a couple figuring things out, working through challenges like many others do. Nothing about it immediately suggested danger. But what people saw wasn't the full picture. Social media captures moments, not patterns. It shows seconds, not the buildup. And in situations like this, those small clips can create a version of reality that feels complete, even when it isn't. Inside the home, life carried a different weight. Responsibility. Stress. The pressure of maintaining a household with multiple children. The emotional demands that come with that kind of environment. And within that space, the relationship between Rolanda and Jerry continued to shift, in a dynamic that was becoming harder to manage, even if it wasn't fully visible to everyone around them. There's a pattern that shows up in situations like this, where everything appears functional on the outside, while internally, the foundation is becoming less stable. And that contrast can make it difficult for others to fully grasp what's happening, because nothing looks obviously broken until it is. Family members would later speak about the relationship in a way that reflected concern. Not shock at the existence of problems, but shock at how far things ultimately went. That's the difference. The issues were known, the outcome was not expected. And that gap is where cases like this often sit. In that space between something isn't right and no one thought it would end like this. Because escalation doesn't always announce itself clearly. It builds. It changes tone. It shifts from manageable to unpredictable. And inside that home, in the days leading up to February 4th, that shift was already in motion. February 4th didn't begin with chaos. Inside the home on Sycamore Street, the day moved the way most mornings do in a house filled with children. There was movement, voices, the usual rhythm of people getting through the start of the day. Nothing about those first moments suggested how quickly everything would fall apart. Rolanda was there, present, in the same space she had spent so many days before, managing the home, being around her daughters, holding everything together in the way she always had. Jerry Watkins III was there too. And at some point, the normal flow of the morning began to change. It didn't happen all at once. It started with words. They weren't alone. Several of their children were inside the home, close enough to hear the change in tone, close enough to feel that something wasn't right. For them, this wasn't just background noise. It was happening in their space, in the place that was supposed to feel safe. The argument reached a point where it stopped sounding like something that would pass. There was a break in the noise, a pause, not calm but a sudden drop in sound that didn't feel normal. And then, gunshots. More than one. Everything that had been building ended in seconds. Inside that home, reality shifted instantly. Rolanda had been shot multiple times. In the same place where her children lived, where they slept, where they trusted that nothing like this could ever happen. At least 4 of her daughters witnessed what happened to their mother. Not hearing about it later. Not learning through someone else. They saw it. A moment that would stay with them, long after everything else changed. The home that had been filled with routine and familiarity was no longer recognizable. The voices were gone. The argument was over. And in its place was something final. Emergency calls were made. The situation was reported. But inside the house, the damage had already been done. There was no undoing what had just happened. No reversing it. No returning to the life that existed just minutes earlier. Because in a matter of seconds, everything had been taken. And the people who were left inside that home were now facing something they were never supposed to experience. Outside, the response was already in motion. Law enforcement was on the way. But inside, time had already run out. By the time police arrived, it was already too late. The calls coming in were urgent. Reports of gunfire. A domestic situation that had escalated beyond control. The kind of call that immediately shifts everything into high alert. Officers arrived at the home on Sycamore Street knowing this wasn't routine. Inside, the situation was still active. Rolanda had already been shot, but the danger hadn't ended with the gunfire. The person responsible, Jerry Watkins III, was still inside the house. Armed, unpredictable, and not coming out. Officers moved carefully. Every step had to be controlled. Every decision had to account for the fact that there could still be risk, not just to themselves, but to anyone else inside, because at that moment, there was uncertainty. Uncertainty about whether anyone else was in danger. Uncertainty about whether more violence could happen. Uncertainty about how the situation would end. Commands were given from outside the home. Clear. Direct. But there was no immediate response. Inside, Jerry had barricaded himself. That decision changed everything. Minutes stretched. The tension didn't drop, it held steady. Officers had to prepare for multiple outcomes at once. Negotiation, forced entry, containment. Every possibility had to be considered. And through it all, the focus remained the same. Bring the situation to an end without more lives being lost. Eventually, after that period of uncertainty, Jerry Watkins III was taken into custody. The threat inside the home was finally contained. But by then, the situation had already reached its worst point. Rolanda was gone. And nothing about what had just happened could be reversed. The scene shifted from active danger to aftermath. From response to reality. Inside that house, what remained wasn't just evidence of a crime. It was the absence of someone who had been at the center of that home. The presence that held everything together, gone in a matter of seconds. And for those who were there, especially the children, the events of that day didn't end when the police arrived. That was only the beginning of what they would have to carry forward. Because while the situation had been contained, the impact hadn't. If you're still watching, take a moment and let me know where you're watching from right now. Stories like this don't just happen in one place. They happen in communities everywhere. And I want to hear your thoughts on this. When you look at cases like this, where everything seemed normal on the outside, what do you think people are missing? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes the signs are there, but they're not always seen in time. When the news reached Rolanda's family, it didn't feel real. There are some calls that don't make sense when you first hear them. Words that register, but don't fully land. And for her loved ones, this was one of those moments. Confusion came first, then disbelief. Because how do you process something like this, when the person you're being told about was just alive, just present, just part of your everyday life? Rolanda's sister would later speak out, trying to find words for something that didn't feel like it could be explained. Her voice carried more than just grief. It carried shock, frustration, and a question that kept repeating in different forms. How did it come to this? To her family, Rolanda wasn't just a victim in a case. She was someone they had grown up with, someone they had shared memories with, someone who had her own personality, her own energy, her own way of showing love. And most of all, she was a mother. That's what made the loss feel even heavier. Because this wasn't just about one life being taken, it was about everything connected to that life. Inside that family, attention quickly shifted to the children. 6 daughters. 6 young lives now facing a reality that no child is prepared for. A reality where the person they relied on the most was suddenly gone. And not in a way that could be explained gently, not in a way that allowed for gradual understanding, but in a way that was sudden, violent, and impossible to ignore. For at least 4 of those girls, the memory wouldn't come from stories or second-hand accounts. It would come from what they saw, from being there, from witnessing something no child should ever have to witness. And that changes everything. Because grief in that situation isn't just about missing someone. It's tied to a moment, a specific, painful moment that becomes part of how they remember their mother. That's what makes this kind of loss different. It doesn't just leave absence, it leaves images, feelings, questions that don't have easy answers. Family members had to step in quickly, not just to process their own grief, but to protect and support the children left behind. Rolanda's sister took on that responsibility, determined to keep the girls together, determined to give them stability in a moment where everything else had been taken from them. Because in situations like this, there's no time to grieve slowly. There are immediate needs. Care, guidance, presence. Everything Rolanda once provided now had to be carried by someone else. And while the family was trying to hold itself together, the community around them was also reacting. Shock spread quickly. Neighbors, friends, and people who knew of the family struggled to understand how something like this could happen in a place that felt familiar. Because from the outside, it didn't look like a situation that would end this way. That's what made it harder to process. There wasn't a clear warning that everyone had seen. There wasn't a moment where people could say, "We knew this was coming." Instead, there was a gap between perception and reality. And that gap left people searching for answers. But beyond the questions, beyond the conversations, beyond the reactions, the most lasting impact remained inside that family. 6 daughters, now without their mother. 6 lives that would grow up with a space that could never be filled the same way again. Milestones she wouldn't be there for, moments she wouldn't witness, guidance she would no longer be able to give. And for the people who loved her, the weight of that reality didn't fade with time. Because this wasn't just about what happened on one day, it was about everything that came after, everything that changed, everything that would never be the same again. At this point in the story, it's important to pause and look at the bigger pattern. Not to guess at private thoughts, and not to force an explanation where one may never fully exist, but to understand how domestic conflict can move from tension to tragedy. Cases like this often do not begin with one explosive moment. They build through repeated strain, ongoing disagreements, emotional pressure inside the home, arguments that stop feeling temporary and start becoming part of the relationship itself. That matters, because when conflict becomes frequent, people around it can begin to normalize it. They may see it as just another argument, just a rough period, or something the couple will work through on their own. But repeated conflict can change the atmosphere of a home over time. It can wear people down emotionally, make reactions stronger, and make already difficult situations harder to calm once they begin. In Rolanda Watkins's case, there were known marital issues. That alone does not predict violence. Many couples experience serious problems and never reach this point. But when tension keeps building without resolution, each new disagreement can carry more weight than the last. And that is one of the most important patterns to understand. The danger is not always in one single argument. Sometimes the danger is in what that argument is sitting on top of. Weeks, months, or even longer periods of frustration, resentment, pressure, and conflict that have never truly settled. Another important factor is the contrast between public image and private reality. When a couple appears happy online, it can shape how others interpret the relationship. Friends, relatives, neighbors, and viewers may assume things are stable because the visible moments look normal. Smiles, laughter, and short videos can create the impression that whatever issues exist are minor or already resolved. But public moments do not tell the whole story. They capture what is shown, not what is carried. And that difference can make it harder for outsiders to see when a relationship is under serious strain. There is also the issue of escalation. In many domestic conflicts, the shift from verbal tension to physical violence happens quickly. What starts as a heated exchange can intensify within seconds, especially when emotions are already high and the people involved are not stepping away from the situation. The speed of that change is part of what makes these cases so devastating. A moment that begins with words can end in irreversible harm before anyone nearby has time to intervene. That is why repeated high-intensity conflict should never be dismissed as meaningless. Not because every argument leads to violence, but because once conflict starts rising in intensity, the risk attached to it also rises. And then there are the children. When conflict happens inside a shared home, children are not separate from it. Even when adults think they are being shielded, children hear changes in tone. They sense fear, they notice tension. And when violence enters that space, the emotional damage reaches far beyond the immediate event. So the deeper lesson here is not about trying to reduce this tragedy to one simple cause. It is about understanding patterns. When conflict is ongoing, when pressure inside the home keeps increasing, when public appearances hide private strain, and when children are living in that environment, the situation deserves to be taken seriously. Because by the time the final breaking point arrives, the damage may already be closer than anyone realizes. Stories like this don't just stay within one home. They force people to look at something bigger, something that shows up again and again, even when it's not immediately visible. One of the clearest takeaways is the gap between what people see and what is actually happening. Online, Rolanda and Jerry looked like a couple sharing normal moments, smiles, laughter, pieces of life that felt positive. And that's what people responded to. That's what they believed. But those moments were only a fraction of the full reality. Social media doesn't show tension after the camera stops recording. It doesn't capture arguments, stress, or the emotional weight people carry behind closed doors. It shows what is chosen, not what is constant. And that gap matters, because when a relationship appears stable on the outside, it can make it harder for others to recognize when something is wrong. It can delay concern. It can create a false sense of security. Another important point is how conflict evolves over time. Not every disagreement is dangerous, but repeated, intense conflict inside a relationship can change how people respond to each other. It can increase emotional reactions. It can make situations harder to control once they begin. And when that tension continues without resolution, each new argument carries more weight than the last. That's where risk begins to rise. There's also a critical moment in many relationships that often carries more danger than people expect. The point where things are breaking down. When stress is high, when emotions are already strained, and when a relationship is no longer stable, interactions can become more unpredictable. What might have once ended in a pause or separation can escalate further than intended. And in some cases, it only takes seconds for that escalation to cross a line that cannot be undone. This is why intervention matters. Not in a distant or abstract way, but in real, everyday situations. When family members notice ongoing tension. When friends see patterns that don't seem right. When people close to the situation feel that something is off. Speaking up, checking in, or encouraging support may not always seem urgent in the moment, but those actions can create space for change before situations reach a breaking point. And then there are the children. They are often present, even when adults assume they are not fully aware. They hear more than people think. They feel the shift in tone. They carry the emotional weight of the environment around them. And when something like this happens, they are not just witnesses to a moment. They are affected long after that moment has passed. So the message here isn't about assigning simple explanations. It's about awareness. Understanding that what looks fine on the surface may not reflect what's underneath. Recognizing that repeated conflict should never be ignored. And remembering that early attention to problems, even when they seem manageable, can matter more than people realize. Because once a situation reaches its final point, there is no way to go back and change it. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Take a moment to subscribe to True Crime Stories Chronicles so you don't miss stories that need to be heard. Share this video with someone, because awareness matters more than we often realize. And I want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this case? Drop them in the comments below. Because sometimes these conversations are the only way people begin to see what's happening around them. And the more we talk about it, the more chance there is that someone, somewhere, notices something before it's too late.